began on one of those cold, forgettable nights in early November when the city never really slept, just dimmed its lights and pretended to rest. The streetlights flickered overhead and cars whooshed past in the distance, as if ignoring the quiet tragedies taking place on the sidewalks, under bus stops, and in alleyways where the forgotten found shelter. And that was where he was, Daniel, a man with worn-out boots, a tattered coat too thin for the season, and eyes that once sparkled with dreams, but now just quietly scanned the world like a ghost walking among the living, invisible except to one, Sunny, a golden retriever who had no owner, no leash, and no hesitation in choosing Daniel as his person from the very first moment they met under a crumbling bridge 4 months ago, where Daniel had tossed his last crust of bread to the stray dog who hadn't barked or begged, but simply looked at him with a kind of warm, steady gaze that Daniel hadn't felt in years. Not since the days when he was a mechanic with a little apartment, a fiancée who sang to him while cooking, and a future bright enough to blind him to life's cruel curveballs, all of which had disappeared in a spiral of job loss, medical bills, and a house fire that took more than just his belongings. And since that day under the bridge, Sunny had been there every night, curling beside him on cardboard sheets, standing guard when other homeless folks got too close, or when strangers walked by with eyes full of judgment, or worse, and Daniel never understood why the dog had chosen him out of all the people roaming the city with outstretched palms and trembling hearts. But Sunny always knew just how close to stay, how to press his warmth against Daniel's chest on freezing nights, and how to bark loud enough to make drug dealers change corners. And while Daniel never begged, sometimes he whispered to God, or whatever was out there, just thanking the heavens for the strange miracle that came with floppy ears and a golden coat. And soon, people started noticing. The barista who worked the night shift left out bits of sandwich crust when she saw Sunny nearby. The security guard outside the closed-up electronics store nodded at Daniel, and once left an unopened bottle of water beside him without a word. And even the teenagers who usually mocked the homeless began to toss bones instead of insults. But the real change began one night when Daniel and Sunny were sleeping outside a church that held soup kitchens every third Sunday, and just past midnight, a scream echoed down the street, high and sharp and laced with terror. And Sunny leapt up like lightning, racing down the block before Daniel could even react, his old knees aching as he stood, and what he saw when he rounded the corner would replay in his dreams for weeks. A young woman, barely 20, pinned against the side of a building by a man with a knife, her purse already on the ground, her face streaked with tears. But Sunny had no fear, only focus, as he growled deep and low, lunging between the attacker and the girl. And the man stumbled back, slicing the air, but not the dog, whose teeth flashed with protective rage, barking so loudly It set off a chain of car alarms down the street, and within moments, lights flicked on, windows opened, and the man fled into the night, chased by the sound of a barking hero, and the girl, trembling, threw her arms around Sonny, whispering thank yous between sobs, and Daniel stood there, stunned, not sure if he should approach, until she turned to him and asked, "Is he yours?" And for the first time in a long time, Daniel smiled, not a fake, weary grin, but a real, heart-deep one, and said, "I think I'm his." And that moment, captured by a man in a nearby window with a phone, would explode online the next morning when the local news ran a segment called "Homeless Man's Dog Saves Girl from Attack." And suddenly, Daniel wasn't invisible anymore. Reporters came with cameras and big, eager smiles, asking questions, offering coffee, taking notes. But Daniel only spoke of Sonny, how he'd saved him long before he saved anyone else, how he was more than a pet. He was family, guardian, angel, and in the flood of attention, a local shelter offered Daniel a warm bed and a nonprofit for homeless veterans. For Daniel had served once, long ago, before the nightmares got too loud, stepped in, offering job training, and still, through it all, Sonny remained the same calm, loyal, never leaving Daniel's side. And at night, no matter how warm the shelter, he insisted on sleeping at the door, eyes watchful, ready to protect his person. But the real shock came not from the media storm, nor the donations that began trickling in from kind strangers who'd read about Sonny's bravery, but from a single envelope that arrived at the shelter one morning, addressed to Daniel in careful handwriting, and inside, a photograph that made his hands tremble. A girl, maybe 7 years old, with red pigtails and a crooked smile, holding a sign that read, "Thank you for saving my mommy." And with it, a handwritten letter from the young woman Sonny had rescued, explaining that she'd once been homeless too, that she'd finally gotten on her feet, that her daughter now asked every night before bed if the hero dog was okay, and that they'd started collecting donations at their church for other homeless people with pets. And reading that, Daniel broke down, not from sadness, but from a swelling, impossible hope he hadn't felt in years. And as the days turned into weeks, and the news faded like it always does, something even more unexpected happened one evening while Daniel and Sonny were walking near the river, enjoying the rare quiet. A man approached, well-dressed, cautious, and when he reached them, he said a name that Daniel hadn't heard in years, Danny, and Daniel froze, eyes narrowing, heart pounding, because only one person had called him that, his brother Mark, who he hadn't spoken to since the funeral, the one that broke their family. And Mark stood there, holding his hat in his hands, eyes glassy, saying he'd seen the news, hadn't believed it at first, but then saw the scar above Daniel's eye, the one from when they were kids, building tree houses, and he started crying, saying he was sorry, that he'd looked for Daniel for years, but hadn't known where to start. And Daniel, too shocked to speak, simply hugged him, the kind of hug that's more earthquake than embrace. And Sunny barked, tail wagging, as if he knew what a moment this was. And Mark took them both to dinner, real food, not wrappers or leftovers, and listened as Daniel told him everything, not just about being on the streets, but about Sunny, and how he never gave up on him. And that night, Mark offered something Daniel hadn't expected, a place to stay, not charity, not pity, just a room, a roof, a start. And it wasn't easy, because healing never is. But with Sunny by his side, Daniel said yes and moved into the spare room of his brother's small house in the suburbs. And for the first time in over a decade, he had a key, a mailbox, a bed. And in the weeks that followed, he found work at a local auto shop, his hands remembering their old strength. And at night, he and Sunny walked together, no longer searching for warmth, but simply enjoying it. And neighbors got used to seeing them, some even stopping to pet Sunny or drop off treats. And slowly, Daniel started holding his head higher, remembering that he wasn't just a statistic, that he had worth, that even when life shatters you, there are still pieces worth keeping. And then one day, while volunteering at the same soup kitchen that once fed him, Daniel met a woman named Teresa, with kind eyes and a voice like music, who worked in social outreach and walked dogs at the local shelter. And they talked, then walked, then laughed, and months later, she moved in with them, Sunny approved, of course. And at their wedding, yes, wedding, Sunny wore a little bow tie and barked during the vows, which made everyone laugh. And as Daniel stood there, holding Teresa's hands, looking out at the people who had once been strangers, but were now his village, he felt something rise in his chest, not just gratitude, not just pride, but a fierce, roaring belief that love finds you, even when you're broken, even when you're forgotten, even when all you have left is a patch of sidewalk and a golden dog who sees something in you that you've forgotten was ever there. And still, every night, even in a real bed with a real family, Sunny slept by the door, ears alert, always protecting, always watching. Because heroes don't retire, they just keep loving. Months passed like slow turning pages in a cherished book, and each one seemed to write a new chapter of healing and rediscovery for Daniel, who no longer walked with slouched shoulders and distant eyes, but instead carried himself with a quiet dignity forged from scars and survival. While Sunny, ever faithful, adjusted seamlessly to this new chapter, trading alleyway corners and cold nights for lazy afternoons under the sunlit porch, where he'd lay beside Daniel's boots, his tail thumping softly against the wood every time a car passed or a bird dared land too close. And though the house they lived in was small, almost cramped, it felt like a palace compared to the concrete silence of the streets, filled with the sound of coffee brewing, Teresa's humming, and the rhythmic jingling of Sunny's collar tags as he trotted between rooms, keeping an eye on his people, always alert, always present. And though life had finally softened its grip on Daniel, he never forgot the years of struggle that preceded this peace, which is why every Sunday morning without fail, Daniel returned to the shelter downtown, not as a guest anymore, but as a volunteer ladling soup, handing out clean socks, sitting beside the same kinds of souls he used to be, listening without judgment, sharing stories only when asked, and always bringing Sunny, whose presence calmed the most anxious and coaxed rare smiles from the deeply weary. Because somehow, even those who didn't speak much would find their fingers running gently through his golden fur, whispering things they wouldn't tell anyone else. And it was during one of those Sundays that Daniel first met Thomas, a quiet boy of about 10 who sat alone at a table near the window, a peanut butter sandwich untouched before him and eyes swollen with the kind of pain no child should carry. And while other kids laughed or played with donated toys in the corner, Thomas just watched the door, flinching slightly whenever it creaked open. And Sunny, who had always had a sixth sense for hurting hearts, walked over without prompting, resting his head gently in the boy's lap, and something broke open in Thomas then. A sob barely held back until that moment, and he wrapped his arms around Sunny's neck like a life preserver, crying into his fur without needing to explain anything. And Daniel watched quietly, remembering how healing had once begun for him in that very same way. And over the weeks that followed, he learned that Thomas's mother had vanished one night after leaving him with a neighbor who couldn't keep him, that the system had shuffled him through a few homes before he ran away to find her himself, believing she was still out there. And though authorities were looking, leads were few. And Thomas had slipped through their fingers, surviving mostly on instinct and stubborn hope. So Daniel called in a few favors, posted Thomas's photo to his veteran network, and within a few days got a call from a retired police officer who recognized the mother's description and location from a domestic violence case she'd escaped from. And long story short, Thomas and his mother were reunited in a teary moment outside a courthouse, where she clutched him so tightly it looked like her arms might never let go again. And Daniel watched from a distance, Sunny by his side, thinking how fate sometimes uses the most unexpected hands to knit lives back together. And the media picked up the story again. Homeless man turned hero helps reunite family. But this time, Daniel politely declined interviews, saying the real hero had 4 legs and golden fur, and all he'd done was pay forward what was once given to him. But something had shifted in Daniel after that day. A fire lit that hadn't burned in years, and he realized that while his pain had once caged him, it could now become a key for others. So he began visiting schools, community centers, and shelters, sharing his story, not to gain sympathy, but to shatter the stereotypes of homelessness and show what one person and one good dog could do. And Sunny, of course, came to every talk, wearing a little vest that read "Therapy Dog in Training." Though everyone agreed he didn't need training, he was born for it, and together they became a symbol not of charity, but of resilience. And soon, a local animal rescue reached out to Daniel with a bold idea, a program that paired rescue dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD, creating a mutual healing experience. And they wanted Daniel to help design it, calling it Project Sunny, in the dog's honor. And how could he say no? So he did, pouring his heart into it, crafting training routines, housing plans, therapy partnerships, and speaking to dozens of fellow veterans whose eyes lit up when they met the dogs, many saying things like, "I haven't felt this calm in years," or "He just gets me." And Daniel understood it all too well, because Sunny had once saved him not with words, but presence. And as the project launched and gained traction, Daniel was offered a part-time position coordinating outreach. And though he was nervous, Teresa stood by him with her hand in his and Sunny at his feet. And he said yes, not just for himself, but for every veteran still out there sleeping rough, unheard, and unseen. Because now he had a purpose that stretched beyond just surviving. He was building something lasting. And with the program's rise came attention, and one day, during a National Veterans Mental Health Conference, Daniel was invited to speak on stage, sharing his story with thousands, his hands shaking as he approached the podium. But when he looked down and saw Sunny watching him from the front row, tail swishing, eyes steady, the nerves melted, and his voice found its strength, weaving a story of loss, pain, redemption, and the golden thread that held it all together. And when he finished, the standing ovation was thunderous, not for him, but for the truth he'd told. And that night, he sat under the stars with Sunny, scratching behind his ears and whispering, "You changed everything, you know that." And Sunny licked his hand, curling beside him like always. And just when it felt like life had offered him more than he ever dared hope, the unthinkable happened. Sunny began limping, subtly at first. A hesitation on the stairs, a stumble during walks, then more pronounced. And no matter how much Daniel hoped it was just age or strain, deep down he knew. And the vet confirmed it, a tumor pressing against the spine, operable, but risky, painful. And though Daniel's heart clenched in his chest, he swore to do everything to ease Sunny's pain, not just for what he had done, but for who he was. And they opted for surgery, a delicate procedure with long odds, but a small glimmer of hope. And the night before, Daniel lay on the floor beside Sunny, whispering stories of all they'd done together, tears soaking into his fur as he held him close. And when Sunny was wheeled into the sterile white of the surgical room, Daniel prayed, not as a man who expected miracles, but as one who had already received one, and begged for just a little more time. And hours crawled by like years, until finally the vet returned, removing his mask with a tired but hopeful smile, saying, "He made it through." And Daniel wept, full-body sobs of relief. And when Sunny finally opened his eyes in recovery, weak but aware, Daniel kissed his muzzle, promising he'd never leave his side, And true to that, he slept on the floor of the clinic for days, until Sunny was cleared to go home. And their bond, already unbreakable, became something almost spiritual, deeper than loyalty, deeper than friendship. It was soul-knitted. And while Sunny never ran quite as fast again, or jumped as high, his eyes stayed bright, and his heart, still as full as ever, beat beside Daniel's through every new chapter. And years passed. Seasons turned, and life carried them forward. And eventually, after Sunny's 12th birthday, Daniel began writing a book, not for fame, but to preserve their story, a tribute to a dog who had rescued a man, by simply loving him without condition. And when the book was published, Sleeping Under Stars, the dog who saved me, it resonated deeply, touching hearts across the country, and letters poured in, some from former addicts, others from foster kids, soldiers, mothers, all saying the same thing: I see myself in this. And Daniel answered everyone, often with a paw print stamped beside his name, Sunny's personal signature. And through it all, through the pain, the healing, the spotlight, and the quiet moments, Sunny remained the same, guarding Daniel every night, now from a plush dog bed instead of concrete, but with the same fierce devotion. And then came the night Daniel feared for years, when Sunny didn't rise to greet him at the door, only lifted his head slowly, tail wagging weakly. And Daniel knew the time had come, and he lifted Sunny gently, laying him beside him on their porch, wrapped in a blanket under the stars. And for hours they lay together, Daniel whispering, "Thank you, thank you." And when the sun rose, Sunny took one final breath, peaceful and still in Daniel's arms. And it felt like a piece of Daniel had been carved out, hollow and echoing. And the days that followed were quiet, unbearably so, but the love Sunny gave him didn't end. It spread. It lived on in every dog placed with a veteran, every meal served at the shelter, every kid who felt safe hugging a therapy dog. And though Daniel grieved deeply, he smiled too, because Sunny had shown him how to live, how to heal, how to love again. And years later, a statue was placed outside the shelter where they first met. A bronze golden retriever sitting alert with kind eyes, and a plaque that read, "To the ones who guard us in silence, who find us in the dark, and lead us home," in memory of Sunny, the dog who saved thousands by saving one. Years passed like autumn leaves, blown gently by time's whispering wind. And though Sunny had long crossed that invisible bridge that separates presence from memory, his paw prints remained, not just on Daniel's heart, but on sidewalks, shelters, stages, and stories far beyond what either of them could have imagined in those cold alley days. And Daniel, now older, his beard streaked with silver and his steps slower, carried his golden friend not in a leash, but in legacy, continuing the mission they had begun together, visiting more towns, helping build more bridges between pain and purpose, speaking not as a broken man, but as a mended soul who had learned that the heart, when guided by love, can be an indestructible compass, and Sunny's statue stood not alone anymore. Over time, dozens more joined it in various cities, small bronze and stone dogs, immortalized in honor of real canines who had changed real lives, all inspired by that one golden retriever with eyes full of sun and silence. And each year, on the anniversary of Sunny's passing, a candlelight gathering would form at the original shelter. Veterans, children, counselors, volunteers, and people from all walks of life, sharing stories of how one dog's love had rippled through them. And Daniel would sit quietly at the back, listening, smiling, crying, holding an old red collar in his hands like a sacred relic, worn smooth by years of hope and healing. And one year, a young girl approached him, maybe 12 years old, her arm around a rescued beagle missing one eye, and she said, "My brother was going to hurt himself, but your book stopped him. He's okay now." He told me Sunny saved him too, and Daniel knelt, holding her hand and whispering, "Then Sunny's still working." And later that night, he wrote in his worn leather journal, "He never really left. He just found more homes to guard." And though he lived alone in a quiet cottage near the woods now, surrounded by trees and a garden he tended with patient care, Daniel was never lonely, because every corner of that home held echoes. Sunny's old bed, now neatly folded with the last blanket he'd used, a framed photo by the fireplace of their first day out of the shelter, letters from strangers, pinned gently to a corkboard like butterflies too sacred to trap. And even in dreams, Sunny still came, sometimes younger, bounding through grass, sometimes older, resting his head on Daniel's lap under golden light. And Daniel never questioned those dreams. He believed they were visits, gifts from whatever kind and mysterious place dogs go when they're called back to the stars. And in his final years, Daniel poured everything he had left into expanding Project Sunny, now a national movement with hundreds of therapy dogs, trainers, and counselors united under the simple but profound belief that love, pure, loyal, and wordless, could heal even the most shattered among us. And the board offered to name the foundation after Daniel too, but he declined gently, saying, "This story never belonged to me. It began with him." And when they insisted on something, he approved the final name, the Sunny and Souls Foundation, because every soul they touched was now part of the legacy. And not long after that, Daniel, his body slowing like the final pages of a book nearing its last lines, began feeling the weight of time settling into his bones like soft sand. And one chilly autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted down like falling memories, he woke and knew, not with fear but peace, that his journey was almost complete. And he didn't resist it. He welcomed it, not as an end but a reunion. And that day, he took a walk through the woods, cane in hand, stopping by every tree Sunny had once marked, every rock they'd sat on, every patch of grass where they had once chased fireflies in the dark. And he paused by a small stream where Sunny used to splash. Sitting on the old bench they built together from driftwood and rope. And as the light dimmed and birds quieted, Daniel closed his eyes, hand still holding that old red collar, and whispered, "I'm ready, buddy." And somewhere between heartbeat and breath, between silence and stars, he felt a warm nose nuzzle against his cheek, a familiar presence curling beside him. And though no one saw him pass, those who found him said his face held no fear, only peace. And beside him in the grass, pressed gently into the dirt, were faint but unmistakable paw prints, as if someone had come to guide him home. And news of Daniel's passing swept through every branch of the foundation, through every shelter, every paw therapy circle, every veterans group, and candles were lit across the country, not in sorrow alone, but in gratitude. And the board declared October 17th as Sunny and Daniel Day, a celebration of compassion, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between human and dog. And each year since, people gather, some with dogs, some without, but all with hearts made a little softer, sharing stories around campfires or on porches, reading the book that started it all, Sleeping Under Stars, aloud to their children or just to themselves. And at the original shelter, now a thriving resource center named the Sunny Haven, a small bronze bench was placed next to the statue. And on it, etched in delicate script, the final words Daniel ever wrote in his journal. Sometimes the soul we're searching for doesn't walk on two legs, but four. And when they find us, they don't speak. They do stay in memories, in moments, in tail wags that echo forever, and in the quiet, comforting truth that sometimes the deepest love needs no words, no reasons, no grand gestures, just presence, just loyalty, just two hearts beating side by side under a sky full of stars. And so ended the tale of a broken man and a street-worn dog who found each other not by chance, but by destiny, changing not only their own fates, but the lives of thousands, proving that no matter how far we fall, how lost we become, there is always a light, always a paw reaching out from the dark. And if we're lucky enough to take it, it might just lead us home.